Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation looking at the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so with a strong focus on what President Gorbachev got up to. But first, context. It's always important. And straight away, and if you're a regular to my videos you won't be surprised by this, I'm going to say you'll find a lot more detail in my ebook on Amazon. But let's tease out the key points in this presentation. The Soviet Union was in desperate straits by the time Gorbachev became its leader. Its economy had never been able to deliver the standard of living and the material benefits that people enjoyed in the West. Such was the severity of the food shortages that the Soviet Union had to import grain from America and other Western countries. What's more, Soviet goods had a reputation for being of a very poor quality, and there was nothing like the variety of goods that was available in the West. Housing standards were poor, as were standards of healthcare, whilst freedoms that were part of the way of life in the West, civil rights and personal freedoms, were still being denied Russians. Now let's turn to Gorby. Gorbachev was of a very different breed to previous Soviet leaders. Although he was a committed communist, he had no connection with the Stalin years, and he was aware that things had gone badly wrong and could not continue. So he sought to change things, hence perestroika or restructuring. He wanted to borrow from Western banks in order to pay for imports of foodstuffs, raw materials and equipment, as well as get help from Western firms to build factories and plants in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev wanted to modernize Soviet industry, make it more efficient, and direct the economy to producing more and better quality consumer goods. He realized that a degree of free enterprise and competition would have to be introduced. In particular, small businesses would need to be encouraged. He also wanted to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and reduce troops across Eastern Europe, and he wanted to reduce spending on the Soviet Union's nuclear deterrent too. Perestroika had three strands to it: a liberalization of the economy, greater freedom for the media, with obvious links to glasnost, and the democratization of the political system. The law on state enterprises allowed enterprises to operate under their own management. The law on cooperatives allowed for private cooperative enterprises. Workers were also allowed to leave collective farms. But perhaps the most radical step was the joint venture law, which allowed for shared foreign ownership of state enterprises and cooperatives, which of course opened them up to foreign investment. Gorbachev also introduced multi-candidate elections for 1,500 seats in the Congress of People's Deputies. Candidates had to be independents though, other political parties were not allowed, and 750 seats would still be appointed by the Communist Party. But as the Congress of People's Deputies elected the Supreme Soviet, it too was under less party control. It wasn't democracy as the West understood it, and the Communist Party still held 80% of the seats after the March-April 1989 election. Russians still voted for communists. But it was nevertheless a radical change, too radical for party conservatives. And Gorbachev knew he would come up against opposition from those entrenched in the Communist Party, hence glasnost or openness. He set out to bypass those in the party who he knew would oppose him, and he appealed directly to the people instead. So censorship was eased in newspapers and also in books, the arts, films and music. But this meant criticism had to be tolerated, which made perestroika and glasnost a high-risk strategy. But because the Soviet Union's finances were in such a desperate state, Gorbachev felt he had to do even more to reduce the costs of its military budget. In December 1988, he committed the Soviet Union to reducing its armed forces, conventional as well as nuclear. Soviet troops had already begun their withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the army would be reduced by 10%. Talks were also begun to reduce NATO and Warsaw Pact conventional forces, and to reduce long-range missiles, the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or START. The army was not happy with any of this, and this would be of critical importance. Perestroika had opened up the cracks that had always been present in the Soviet system, and the sense of order that the country had been used to, albeit at the severe restriction of freedoms, was replaced with uncertainty, unrest and disorder. Inflation, increasing food shortages and rising crime were all blamed on Gorbachev and his policies. And the new freedom meant that criticisms were being voiced and heard, as was always likely to be the case. And if this was the new reality in the Soviet Union, it was worse in the countries of Eastern Europe under Soviet control, as Gorbachev seemed to be introducing the very reforms that had been denied the Hungarians in 1956 and the Czechs in 1968, and he was determined that the Eastern European states would be left to sort out their own problems. The Soviet Union would not interfere. Gorbachev had repeatedly made this clear, but he spelt it out at a meeting of Eastern European leaders in March 1989. This was part of his new thinking for foreign policy, and it meant that the Brezhnev doctrine was dead in the water. So, an outline of why Gorbachev forced through reforms and what those reforms did. I'll look at their results, and let's be clear, Gorbachev lost control of events in a separate presentation. What's left for me here is to remind you of what else I have to offer. My website, History Made Easier, my ebooks on Amazon. Buy the sets of books if you're interested, they're much better priced. And there are my tutorials, again, if you're interested. But for now, I'll simply thank you for listening and wish you the best of luck with your studies. Cheers.